So I'm going to talk about a lot of work, and I talk a lot and I show a lot, but I'm going to do something I've never done before, which is show really early work. And well, it's not this early. I'm not that old, but just because I'm going to try it this time. I've never done it because my work really has shifted a lot, and it continues to shift. But it's a real break from what people know, the early stuff, and also because I think it's great to sort of see that one does shift and change in their work, sometimes dramatically from graduate school, and uh, and that's a good thing. And also, for me, just digging out these old things, it was interesting to see the threads that are still there, even though, at least conceptually, certainly not physically, but you know. So I thought I'd try this time, if you bear with me. But I was starting with this image, which is a painting by Tiepolo, not me, and because it was on my mother's coffee table when I was growing up, and my mother's passed away, but I came across this book and I saw this picture, and I remember that that I asked her who this child was, leaning over the canvas there, this black boy, and because she knew quite a bit about art history, she had been sort of an artist, studied art in college, and she knew that some of the other characters. However, she didn't know who that boy was. In fact, the man painting, it is an allegorical painting, but the man painting is Tiepolo. He painted himself in the painting, and he often did that. And the person he's painting is his wife. This is an allegorical painting, but which prompted my question, who's this boy? And she couldn't tell me. And it wasn't in the book. It wasn't anywhere. And so it's funny that I would find this recently. But anyway, I asked that question and didn't get answered, and I just went on with my life. Let's see now. Now for the technology. Everything magically should work here. But sort of jumping to the 80s, early 80s, I was making sculpture, most of it outdoor sculpture, a lot of it from my experience in school, where I was interested in spaces and environments that one could wander through and work on. I was an art major at college, but I also studied dance. I studied archaeology, and a couple other things. I mean, took courses in all these things, and so it kind of informed my interests, or my interest informed the classes that I took. This is some old thing that I did in the early '80s, an exhibition that was inside the Grand American Plaza Monument in Brooklyn. They used to have exhibitions there. I don't know if they still do, but and I did this sculpture, which is called Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted, the great landscape architect. And I was interested in a body moving through space. You could climb on this thing, and in fact, this for me is sort of a landform. Is the actual image of Audubon. If you looked at it from way above, it would look like John James Audubon's face. And I was doing that because I had traveled to various places in Egypt, and particularly Peru, flying over the desert, looking at the Nazca lines, and then going to Cusco and various other places where, some place in Cusco, the mountains were shaped in the shape of birds and other things. And so that really impressed me greatly. So because I was interested in the body in space and landscape forms and archaeology, this made sense for me to make at that time. And history, obviously, because of Olmsted's history. Not only was he a landscape architect, but he was an abolitionist. And so I started doing a bunch of these things. This one, there used to be a place called art program called Art on the Beach, and that actually is where let's see, it used to be downtown, where way downtown, Lower Manhattan, and it was just a big landfill. And so this organization, Creative Time, which is still around, had programs for artists to come and do projects on this landfill. Now, I don't know what's in that landfill, asbestos, I don't know what, so it's whatever it was, it's in my body now. But anyway, it's a beautiful space right on the water. And again, this was a sculpture that I built and painted, and I collaborated with a project. It was myself, a jazz musician, and Yoshiko Chuma, a choreographer, and they did a performance on this platform. I don't have any pictures of it, but it sort of went along my ideas about having an image on the landscape that if you're in a tall building, you could look down and you could see who it was. This is Muhammad Ali, and I was interested in using people who were really famous outside of the United States and for various types of people. And a lot of them you would not know who it was if you were climbing on it. This is a little model of a piece of John James Audubon, the great naturalist, whose racial identity is still discussed and contested and such. But I was fascinated with these outsider people who became really well known, and sort of it was one of those interests of mine, how they intersected with history as well. And this is a model that I did for the Public Art Fund, and it was the first one that I got somebody to actually pay for. And it was downtown in a little triangle downtown near West Broadway, on West Broadway. And this is the piece that came out of it. Again, it was supposed to be interacted with, sat upon. Nobody really sitting there would know that it's the face of Audubon. It was specifically between two trees, and I made birdhouses in the style of architecture of the places that he lived. He lived in the South. He lived in the Caribbean, and other places. So there were different types of housing forms the idea was that it would bring birds to the site, and it did. And people could sit on it and eat their lunch. There was no place to eat your lunch or for the business people. And so they did use it. Now, there was a problem in that birds make a mess, and eventually, this was New York City in the 80s, and it became a homeless encampment. And so the businesses, were not too happy with the piece in the end. So the piece went away, but the birdhouses stayed there for years and years and years, until they started falling apart. And this was like maybe even 5 years ago. They were still there. And it totally looks different down there now. But this is just showing kind of things I was thinking about at that time. Now, of course, I didn't support myself doing all these things. I used to work in nonprofit galleries. When I first came to New York, I worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I worked at the American Museum of Natural History, and the American Crafts Museum, which is now the Museum of Arts and Design, in the education department. And so, in addition to my college museum, I was a museum guard. So I kind of was in lots of museums in one form or another, in one capacity or another. However, it really affected me because I had just come out of school, and so I still had that all in my head. And working at these two museums in the education departments, just sort of as part-time, just coming and going from classes, sometimes going across the park between the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Natural History in the same day. What I found fascinating about them is that they're very similar museums housing culture, sometimes the same culture, but how they talked about it, how they displayed it, how people interacted with it was very different, one museum to the other. And it was very noticeable for me, having just come out of art school, being very visually aware, and so being a visitor to the museum, but also a staff person, having all these different experiences, and an artist, with interacting and seeing how people interact with the museum. So it kind of stayed in the back of my head for a long time, at least while I was working there. And so eventually, just sort of collapsing some time, I worked running programs for kids in East Harlem, and I I used to run a program in a nonprofit gallery downtown, and then finally someone invited me to run a gallery of my own up in the Bronx, in the South Bronx. And I'm originally from the South Bronx. Never thought I'd go back there, but anyway, I was originally from the South Bronx, and this job was just too great for me to sort of resist, and so I ran a program in this school. This school is. There were no kids in the neighborhood because there was no buildings in the neighborhood. Everything was. This is when the Bronx was pretty dilapidated and deserted. So the city gave this to various public institutions, so that the building itself, nobody would steal the pipes, and so it got used quite a bit by people who would go there to pay their rent. There was a literacy program in the building for the local community, this is right around the corner from where Colin Powell grew up, just a little side note. But anyway, and I had my gallery there. I had a gallery and artist studios, and it was called the Longwood Arts Project. And actually, the Longwood Arts Project still exists in the Bronx. It's just moved from this location. So I'm really happy that I started this exhibition space, and it still exists. Anyway, when I first, what was great about this also, I should say, is that since there were artists in the building, and I had a contemporary art gallery, the artists were like ambassadors to the gallery. They'd be out in the neighborhood, hiring various local people to do things for them, and local people to hire them to do various jobs for them. So the artists were coming and going all the time. Tim Rollins of KOS, I don't know if some of you know him and his group, were upstairs. John Ahern, who just had an exhibition, was in the neighborhood, and his work was on the side of the building. It's a very fruitful time in the South Bronx at that time for art and artists. So this is my gallery space that we put in the building. Now the building was obviously, had school classrooms in it, and I changed one room to this gallery space, and then I had a couple other rooms that weren't used for artist studios. And for my first exhibition, or one of my first exhibitions, I did a special project which I really was curious about, which related to my experience, teaching in the museums. Did I say I was an educator in the museums? That's what I was doing in the museums. I was teaching. So I invited 30 artists to collaborate with me. Well, I shouldn't say collaborate. I should say let me experiment with their work in this environment. And I borrowed 2 works each from them, and I put one piece of all these artists in this one room. And then I put the second work in one of the other 2 spaces I had. The exhibition was called Rooms with a View, The Struggle Between Culture, Content, and the Context of Art, because I was really thinking about my experience in the museums and how odd it was seeing, say, African or Asian object artwork in one museum, and they described it, and they talked about it, and they displayed it in one way. And then you go to the American Museum of Natural History, and it was really differently described and talked about. So I want to understand what happens to the object and the artist when you do that. So I made my little mini museums here. I had the regular gallery space. I redesigned another space to look like a natural history ethnographic museum, and then I redesigned another space to look like a turn-of-the-century salon space, like a historic house space. And I put their artworks, they all had one in the contemporary space and one in another one of these other spaces. They dropped their work off, and then I did what I wanted to do with it. And the artists said, there were a lot of them people I knew, they said, "Oh, Fred, go ahead, do whatever you want." It was in the South Bronx. They figured, anything goes up there, so why not? This was my version of an ethnographic natural history museum space in a former classroom. I basically painted the walls this drab color and added objects in it that I felt, of the artist's works, that I felt fit in the space. And it was quite interesting what happened. This artist named Linda Peer came and she arranged her sculpture here on a bed of sand, and then she left. And I came behind her and added this rather ugly white barrier around her work. Now, she had a work very similar to this in the regular gallery space. But this was my ethnographic natural history museum. And who in those museums asks the artists how they want their work displayed? They don't. So I didn't either. And so everything in the room was displayed to the way I thought made sense for an ethnographic natural history museum. Now, we had school children coming, groups of school children coming in, and they came up to the white barrier, and there was a label there, and the label said, "Pile of heads, ceramic, late 20th century, found Williamsburg, Brooklyn." And all that was correct, except I left off perhaps the most important thing to artists, and that's their names. And nothing had anybody's name on any of these works in this space. Of course, they had another work in their contemporary space, and everybody understood what that was. Here, the children looked at these objects, thought they understood it, and went away. Now, I know that was kind of cruel, but it wasn't only children that I fooled. I had a group, a curator with a group of collectors coming into the show to visit, and they stood right in front of this grouping of objects here, and the curator said, "Oh, you have a collection," meaning a collection of primitive art. And I said, well, Valerie, that horse skull sculpture you see there is by an artist named Jimmy Durham, and we had one person show in your gallery a month ago, but so she was very embarrassed. I don't tell her last name, but truly, everything in the room seemed to be made by somebody you could not know. Everything seemed exotic, seemed like somebody far away, and of course, these were all artists who lived in New York City at the time, and so. This was the watershed event for me. I just knew something was going on with these museums that was affecting how you saw the artworks, the display, the environment, because you went into the regular gallery space and you had no problem seeing it as contemporary art, very similar works. The space was really telling you something else. And this was, and it wasn't only me noticing it, it was a very palpable experience. And you'd go, there's a main hallway, and you walk along the hallway going into each classroom, and you see these experiences. This was my version of a turn-of-the-century salon historic house space, as best I could do at a 1940s public school in the South Bronx. And this was a very cheap project. I didn't spend very much money. I didn't have much money to spend on this exhibition. I put up these velvet walls and added artworks on them. And actually, this mantle here is by an artist who is now museum director, and so he loves it when I show this thing. He's no longer an artist. Tom Finkelpearl, who's director of the Queens Museum. Anyway, and so I had this very nice space for these works, and a little harpsichord music playing in the background. What historic house? What would a historic house be without its roped-off chairs? So I had to put a couple in there too. And, I never expected to get a review for this exhibition because, it was not a well-known space. It was in the South Bronx. But we did. We got a review in Artforum for it. And the reviewer said the artwork in this space had an association with wealth, had an authority that's associated with wealth that the works by the same artists in the other spaces just didn't have. And it's true. Each space affected the viewer in its own way. And you can only really notice what it was doing to the artwork by having the room so close together. Even the white cube, the regular gallery space, because you could have these other spaces with the same artist's works in them, you notice that the white space had a very kind of a numbing effect on the artwork in the whiteness of the space. And so everything seemed to be scientifically arranged, and it certainly wasn't. It was just the space making you feel these things, and so it was really a great event for me. I really thought, well, and of course, this has embodied all my interests. Interest in space, in the body in space, interest in history, interest in culture, and so I thought, well, if the space is affecting the artists and the artists' works in all the spaces that you work with, let me be a part of the manipulation of these ideas by creating the spaces, the context for these objects that I make. And just also wanting really to have it exposed for other people to notice this, that they were being led by the nose without even knowing it to think things. So the first project I did after that was in a regular commercial gallery space. I painted the wall this dark color. You paint the wall this color, and all of a sudden it says, truth. It just seems like this is really serious. But in fact, I just painted the wall. And you put this spotlight on these things, and everything seems like it's worth $1 million. This is one of these galleries that, the elevator opened. It used to be lots of them like this. The elevator door would open, and you'd be in the gallery. And I was standing there, and once, and someone coming to visit the gallery walked in and said, "Oh, I'm looking for contemporary art," and she went out again. This happens often with my work, but that's the breaks. Anyway, this piece was called The Colonial Collection. I was particularly interested in African colonialism at the time, and all these works, they're in major museums, particularly in Europe, but also here. And these masks I call spoils, generally because most of these masks have, came out, certainly in European museums, came out so long ago that they came out during the wars between various European groups and the Africans, and during the colonial period. And they exist in these museums to this day. And of course, the labels don't talk anything about that. And beneath these masks is a case, and of course I had these cases made to look like old display cases. Were in the center there were little boxes of insects, and each box had the name of some various African tribes, and the label says, above it says, French and British Collection, 1914. And this, I'll never forget, Hans Haacke said to me, "Oh, I love that mask. Where'd you buy that? How'd you find it like that?" I said, "Hans, I put those flags on that mask." Anyway, when you go to a museum, you believe what you see, no matter if it's a fake museum, even great artists like Hans. And then this mask was sitting there without any label, without any flag. It did have a label, however. Now, no museum in their right mind would have this label. Museums have a whole host of euphemisms for the messiness of history. I was in the Smithsonian, one of the Smithsonian museums, and they had a sculpture, and the label said, "Colonel so-and-so, acquired." Hold on, sorry about this. Oh, shoot. Sorry, shoot. How do we turn it off? I told Barack not to call me. All right, anyway. The word acquired they like to use. And, how does a colonel acquire anything when he's trampling through your town? You say, "Here, you want it?" So, and I had some people upset with me, but that was because it was in a private collection, but it was my private collection, okay, don't worry about it. And so I was really interested in, I came out of a moment in art history where the text and image were very much part of what people were doing, and so this seemed perfectly a direct relationship with that, working with the labels. And certainly you believe what you read in museums. But if the object came out of Africa in 1899, it came out under nefarious situations. This next project was at a gallery that doesn't exist anymore called Gracie Mansion Gallery. This project was done at Metro Pictures. I used to show at Metro Pictures a bunch of years ago. And it was called Panterei, a Gallery of Ancient Classical Art. And because I had lived in Egypt for a bit, hope it's not important. And I saw all these, in the sand, you'd find pieces of Egyptian, sometimes Egyptian things with Greek writing on it, and that was really fascinating me. And also, I read this book, Black Athena, talking about the history of Egypt and language. But doing some research, I realized that in this sort of the classical scholars are not. This is nothing controversial. That the ancient Greek and Roman gods had Egyptian deity predecessors because the countries were so close together. They're warring, trading, and you know the history of Cleopatra and blah blah blah. So I just basically renamed these Greek and Roman characters with their Egyptian names. And then I had a whole gallery of them. And, you know, whenever I was traveling around giving lectures at that time, I'd go to a university that had a gallery of plaster casts, be it in Pittsburgh or wherever I was. Many cities have university galleries have them. And they were always in these light blue rooms. I didn't understand what that was. It was, you know, was it the sky in Greece? Was it Wedgwood? I don't know. But it looked good to me, so I did it too. And, of course, it has that familiarity for those of you who have ever been to those kind of spaces. And so here in this space, I brought together Egypt and Greece in rather forceful manner. I have also some anecdotes, but I've got too many images to show you, but we'll just continue on. And this is the body of Artemis and the head of Bast, both the cat god and the huntress particularly. They're directly related, and I just brought them together. And, you know, I like using humor in my work. It just sort of comes out. I don't try to put it in there. It just sort of comes out. And I figured humor is fine in the service to meaning. And so it's part of my personality, so it comes out when it comes out. You know? And all these things I bought in museum shops. So, you know, it comes back around. I mean, actually, some of the plasters I didn't get in museum shops, but I do hunt the shops for things when I'm doing projects. This says Cleopatra in hieroglyphics. Now, I'd find, you know, Greek writing, ancient Greek writing in the sands of Egypt still, but I don't think you find, I doubt you see hieroglyphics in Greece, but you could maybe someday. And these were my art history books. I think that's much how I felt. I was really glad when the Denver Art Museum bought this piece. I was very happy, got them out of my house. But at any rate, it's called Atlas, and you know the African art book is beneath it because you know it's the foundation of human history, and it could be underneath the underpinning too, or underfoot, depending on how you view it. Oh yes, and now this little piece I do try to show when I have students. This little piece was in a museum auction. People are getting a little interested in my work, so it was in a museum auction, and it's the head of Anubis, the jackal, Egyptian god of the underworld, and the body of Hermes, also a god of the underworld, both of them communicator gods. And so I made this piece and put it in this museum auction, and it was an interesting experience. It was a live auction, and there are two collectors really vying for this artwork. You know, it's a little diminutive thing, but they really wanted it, and the price of it was going up and up and up, and everybody's getting excited because the museum was going to get most of the money. And finally, one of them got it, and she was so excited. She came over to me and she said, "Oh, I'm so happy to have it. It looks like my dog." I have to have a drink of water behind that. So I just want you to know, you just have to put everything you got into that work and hope that your little Rover, Fido, whatever you call your pet, makes it through the collector to the museum, because it lives better than I do, this thing, actually. It has a great home, and so eventually it'll get to a museum. The next project was at Metro Pictures also. It was called Primitivism High and Low. It was the name of there were two different exhibitions at MoMA around that time, two problematic exhibitions in my estimation. And so I did this project, which is very similar to my first project, because there were two different rooms. There was a contemporary space and this kind of ethnographic space. One is very dark and one is very bright. However, I'm only going to be able to show a couple of works from this because it's, this is early 90s. There are these 4 skeletons in 4 cases, and you look in the skeleton, each skeleton said something. Someone's mother, someone's father, someone's sister, someone's brother. I again, traveling around the country, seeing a lot of these university galleries and anthropology departments, archaeology departments, and they'd have these skeletons, and all of them were Native American skeletons, and it just fascinated me that archaeologists are looking at humanity through the bones, but as soon as it gets on display, it belongs to no one, no relations. It's just an object for study and display. This piece was called "Friendly Natives," and this was, I think I did this right before there was a law in the United States by George Bush Sr. that allowed Native people to look at their things that were in collections all around the country and repatriate them, take them back home if they wanted to. And of course, this put fear in the hearts of every museum curator who had things of Native people and all these college museums. But in fact, Native people didn't take everything. They have taken the skeletons, but they did not take everything. Sometimes they felt the things were better served in the museum as long as they come and visit it every so often and do certain rites. And so there's an interesting relation between Native people in the United States and their collections that are in museums. It has turned out to be a really wonderful situation. And I have lots of stories from both Native folks and museums about what happens when people come together around these things. It's sometimes joyous and sometimes very sad. But as I say, I have so much to show you. I'm going to continue on. You came around the wall to the regular gallery space, and you saw these uniforms. And these are guard uniforms of 4 major museums in New York City. Most of them, I should say, are approximated. Only one museum gave me the actual guard uniform, as the security officer at the Met said to me, well, you could just dress that up, come in and take anything you want, So I understand they have issue with that. I understand that. So I approximated what they looked like. Only the Jewish Museum gave me their uniform, which is, I knew the director. Well, even knowing the director doesn't help. In fact, it didn't help at MoMA, knowing the director, knowing the head of the board, because security, like in some countries, security and the boss, they keep their autonomy around their issues. You know what I know what I know, and you know what you know, and as long as we don't, overstep each other. So I had to approximate them even when I knew people in the museum. Anyway, obviously this is not about the beauty of guards' uniforms. It was, I had been a guard, and it was an interesting experience being a guard. You're basically on display, just standing like everything else in the room, and but you were also invisible, and that sort of irony of that just always stuck with me, and I eventually did this work. It's called Guarded View. In fact, museums don't. The guards perform a very important role in museums, and museums actually get. Sometimes they get a tax write-off. Sometimes they get some kind of situation, good money coming from the government because they have large minority employment in their museum. Of course, they don't say where they're employed, in the food service, in the maintenance, in the guards, and no one in the professional staff who decides what gets bought, how you interpret the works that you have, nobody in those roles in the museum. So that's what this piece is all about, certainly having been a guard. Now, before people really knew about this piece, the Whitney Museum invited me to, they were inviting artists to give tours of exhibitions. And so they invited me to give a tour of the exhibition, the education department. And I said, sure, I'll do it. I'll do it if I can be in costume. They said, oh, great. I don't know if they thought I was going to be in a bunny costume or what, but so I had lunch with many of the education staff and the tour guides and such, and many of them I knew because I had been in education at other museums, and people know each other. And so after we had lunch, I said, "Okay, excuse me, I've got to change into my guard's uniform, my uniform now." Luckily, I didn't make that mistake. I said, "I'm going to change my costume now," and they said, "Okay, great." And so I left them, put on a guard's uniform because I know guards in lots of museums, and so I borrowed one from one of the guards, and stood by my sign that said "Fred Wilson Speaks." So I stood there next to the sign, and everybody came down from lunch and stood around in front of me waiting for me to show up. Yes, they did. Yes, they did. And, you know, had it not happened, I would have been really surprised, because you put on the uniform and you're gone. You're just invisible. And my hair wasn't long and wild like this at that time. I was very conservative looking, sort of. And then I started walking around the room talking in art historical terms about everything in the show, and there was a lot of problems, so I started writing on the walls, around the text, and things like that. And the guards came all from their stations to see me do this. They were like, "I always want to say that about that thing." Yeah, they did. It was great. And the public saw this guard talking in art historical language and seeing this crowd follow him around. It was really great. This piece was called My Life as a Dog, but that's a whole other story. And then now, a long story, the piece was bought and sold, and then now the Whitney owns it. And it's great because the guards love it. They, when it's up, the first time it was up, they'd stand next to it, and then somebody would get off the elevator, they'd move, and people would jump. They really like that. But they're headless because they're anonymous, and they're silenced. And they're silent. I mean, back when I did this, this piece, and particularly Sophie Calle had a piece at MoMA where she engaged the guards about the exhibition, about the artworks. And I think the relationship between the guards and the museum staff shifted dramatically after our two works. Because at MoMA, when I was first going around the museums as an educator, the guards would say to me, you know, professional staff, I mean, the curators and the director, they didn't even say hello in the morning. We've been working side by side for, 20 years. That's all changed now. So sometimes art works, I don't know. And the other funny thing is that I'm now a trustee of the Whitney, and so the guards think they got somebody up there that's one of them. The Whitney is a very special place to not only have me, but to do the kind of things that they do. Now, again, this is not my work. This is a room in a historical society in Baltimore. Oh God, I'm getting warm, and. There were curators out there seeing what I was doing I was doing lots of things with making fake collections and making fake museums. And you could almost see a light bulb going off over their heads like, wait a minute, Fred Wilson is making these fake museums. And we're a real museum, and we could bring him here, and we don't have to pay for shipping, and he can make a show. So, actually, two museums did approach me to do this. One was the Contemporary Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and one was the Seattle Art Museum. The Contemporary got the money together first, so I did it in Baltimore first. And so they said I could look at any. The Contemporary is a museum without walls. It's actually no longer in existence now, unfortunately, but it's a museum without walls. And they did projects with artists in bus stations, on streets, everywhere. And they thought, well, maybe Fred would do something in a museum, and we'll help him find a museum to do it. So I went and talked to every museum in Baltimore. They didn't know I was talking to the directors, but I don't know if they knew why I was talking to them. But at any rate, and I chose the Maryland Historical Society to do my project of all the museums in Baltimore, because it seemed to be. This was a contemporary museum in 1850, and this is what happens if you don't keep up. Anyway, so I thought this was raw material for me, and I just wanted to try to see if I could work with this collection. The other reason why I wanted to work there is that I walked in there and felt really uncomfortable in there, and that really made me wonder, why do I feel so uncomfortable in this museum? I mean, the Metropolitan borrows things from this museum. It's all American things, furniture and paintings and stuff. And really, I just knew that I had to. That it was a very, I hadn't been to many historical societies, but this is a very unusual, very strange space. So I figured, well, let me understand why I feel so uncomfortable about being here by making a piece here. And so this is one of their normal galleries. Oh, I dropped this. Hold on a sec. Oh, okay. And so basically, to do this project, I looked at, using their collection, I looked at everything in their museum. I throughout all their collections, and I spoke to everyone in the museum. I'm not from Baltimore, I'm not from Maryland, so I really wanted to understand what the museum was about. I spoke to the curators, but also the registrars and the conservators, as well as the guards and the food staff and the woman behind the desk, front desk, and the volunteers, everyone, about what this place was about. And I talked to other museum directors and museum curators in the area. I also spoke to whatever groups would listen to me, or I'd go to meetings with Rotary clubs and women's groups, all sorts of things in Baltimore, because I really wanted to understand this museum's place in Baltimore. I talked to artists about it. They'd say, "Oh, we've never been there," or "We've been there when we were 10, but we haven't been there back since." And so it was not a known. It was known that it was there, but no one went there. Oh, there were people who went there. I'd go there some days, and there'd be people dressed in antebellum outfits, like from the 19th century, and I was always looking for my free papers. But besides that, not too many people were going. Anyway, so I spent a year working on this project. I haven't had that kind of time to do anything since, but that was really a great project, coming and going from New York City to Baltimore to do research in the collections to figure out what things I was going to make and what the exhibition was about. In fact, I was working on this, trying to see what I wanted to work with of this collection, and I didn't have a title, I didn't have anything, and the PR department was getting a little nervous. They needed something, and the director said, and I said, I don't have a title just yet. And they said, so the PR person talked to the director. The director said, why don't we call it Museum Held Hostage? And I'm like, oh no, we're going to get along here. It's not going to be bad. He was nervous. He was really, really nervous. So I decided I'd call it Mining the Museum, because that's what I was doing. I was digging through their collection, perhaps maybe blow up some ideas about the museum or history or what have you, but mostly because I wanted to make it mine, because I felt so alien in that space. So I found this globe in silver storage. It seems so contemporary, even though it was made in the 19th century. It looked like something Barbara Kruger or Jenny Holzer could have made. But it had that word truth across it, the silver globe with its bronze letters. And so I put it up. That was the first thing you saw. After you went through the museum, you came to my show on the 3rd floor. And this is the first thing you saw. And really, not my name, not the title, just this. And I wanted people to sort of think about, who's truth in a museum? And where's the truth in history? And that was the first shot as you walked in. And I described the globe, and it actually was a trophy for truth in advertising. It came to, they brought it to the museum after 1938. I guess that's when they found out there's no truth in advertising. But anyway, it came to the museum after that. And then these plastic mounts, which had nothing on them, there's label 2, plastic mounts, 1970s, maker unknown. Because I wanted people to understand that the entire exhibition was created by me. Everything may have something to say about its own history. The mounts may say something about the 70s. I don't know, that is important to somebody. But anyway, that the environment was completely controlled. Lighting, the wall colors, the arrangement, everything. The text was controlled by me. And here they are, the globe and the pedestals, surrounded by these pedestals. And everything, again, I found in the Historical Society, everything about Baltimore, Maryland. And so we have these 3 busts. Here we have, a bust of Henry Clay, major American. Andrew Jackson, a major American, which I don't like too much. And you know, they're not from Maryland, but they're in the Historical Society, for some Maryland Historical Society. And then here we have Napoleon. Now, how he got there, I don't know. I didn't think he went to Maryland, but anyway. But I put it out there just because, they were there. And then I had these three other busts, pedestals, no busts. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Benjamin Banneker on the labels. These are three African Americans, very famous in the United States. Nothing about them in the Historical Society, all from Maryland. And so in going through their collections, there's very, very little about African Americans. And, Baltimore is about 75%, 85% African American. And nothing in the Maryland Historical Society. So I could have, actually, there are lots of, material in Baltimore about, material culture about African American history and all the like. I mean, but I didn't, so I could have made a really interesting Black History Month show, but really my interest was really about what this museum's view of that history was. And the only way to understand that was looking at its collecting patterns, because the contemporary curators did not create the museum. They just sort of are there. It has to do with it's embedded in the museum's history via the way things were collected. And so things that were not there said as much as what was there. So often there were these kind of gaps, and you'd have to ask yourself that question. Now, every old museum in the United States, has cigar store Indians. They don't know what to do with them. They're problematic, but they keep them and hope nobody asks any questions. So they had a lot of them. So I put them all together, facing away from you. So they're nice sculptures, but they're just problematic because these don't look like any Indians I've ever known. In fact, this one over here is sculpted by a German immigrant of his daughter. Of course, I never get any calls, and this is. Okay, let me turn this off. Okay. And they're facing away from me. What are they facing? I asked the curator. I wanted to meet some of the native people in Baltimore, and because I do that, I have native friends, artist friends, and stuff, and so I figured I'd meet the families and find out the history. The curator said, "Oh, well, there are no Indians in Maryland." I'm like, "Oh, really? Is that so?" And so I found the community and borrowed works, photographs of their families, and that's what the photographs are on the wall. What also is on the wall is the map of the Chesapeake Bay, which is the bay in Baltimore, from a show that was previously there of duck decoys. And the curators didn't like that so much. Some trustee put them up to that exhibition. But anyway, it had the names of the locations, but also the duck hunting clubs as well. I just don't believe this. This never happens. I have to turn this damn thing off. Anyway, I'll just continue. And of course, old museums, they had all these arrowheads, these Indian arrowheads, and there are just so many of them. I put them all out and called it a collection of numbers. And I brought things from the paintings from the other floors below, brought them up and put them in the gallery, moved them from where they were located, and put them in my gallery. There are some really funny things about these paintings. And I noticed it, but nobody seems to notice it. This painting, I'm sorry, this slide I realize is not so great, but it's a dark slide. But these were dark paintings. And you have there are 7 children in the painting. There are the 5 in the center, and then one child here. This is his collar. One child here in the doorway. This is his arm. And in all the paintings I found, there was a black child in the periphery, in the margins. And the director, the next image I'll show you, the director said he never noticed the black children in the paintings. And it's kind of a, a stretch since he went to the museum every day. But you were really not meant to see those children if you walked around the museum. You were not really meant to think about the black community in Baltimore when you're at that museum. You were not even supposed to think about immigrants. Actually, you were not supposed to think about poor people or just average people. You were there to sort of love and feel a part of the elite of Maryland. And that was what they had on display. That's what they talked about, and very little on anybody else. And so you didn't ask those questions. The museums are great silencers of dissent. They know how to make you not ask those questions or feel you can't ask those questions. So I was asking those questions. And what I did was I worked with education departments. I brought the black children from the neighborhood and from various schools in, and we talked about these paintings. And so I had lights illuminating the two black children in the periphery. Obviously, these are slave children, and I'll tell you about why I do that. But this is a 19th century painting, so they were. And a light would illuminate these children as you stood up in front of them. And then I made tapes of the children, and the voices would come on as you stepped in front of the painting. And they'd say things like, who calms me when I'm afraid? Who washes my back? Where's my mother? Things like that. And so as you walked around the room, all these voices would come off these paintings. Yeah, this is this painting that the director said he never noticed the black child. In fact, when we moved the painting, we realized the black child had a metal collar around his neck. And certainly he was like the voice in this painting said, am I your friend? Am I your brother? Am I your pet? And clearly, in the horrors of slavery, he could have been all three. Certainly, the white child has the bow and arrow. The black child has the bird. He was like the golden retriever for this child. And obviously, in the paintings, these children represent, like every other object in the painting, the wealth of that particular family. And obviously, some paintings have their pets in the paintings, the children's pets in the paintings as well, dog, cats, and other little children. This was not what they expected, I have to tell you, with the exhibition. But, museum people, everybody's really nice. They smile, And I really think that the curator says, well, this is not my exhibition, and the director brought him in, so that's, it's his problem. Anyway, in fact, we got along really well. And here is a painting called Country Life, painted in 1850. Now, you should know, or maybe you already know, that early paintings, in America at least, were not named necessarily. And so more than likely, the artist did not name this painting Country Life. Somebody else did, either the curator, the collector, but not the artist. So I figured, well, if the artist didn't name it Country Life, well, I could name it too. So I left their label on that side of the painting, and I made my own label and named it on the other side of the painting, which I called Frederick Serving Fruit. My name is Fred, of course, and there was Frederick Douglass was from there. So museums have, as I said, they have ways to make you not think things, focus you on things they want you to focus on, and they don't even know they're doing it. Essentially, I have to say. And then this was a museum that organized things in a connoisseurship fashion, which means they're really interested in the style, the aesthetic of the object, and they use very little labels where they compare and contrast basically beautiful things. And I did the same thing. I didn't want to change so drastically how they did their display, because really I wanted the meaning to come out rather than my fancy display coming out. So here in this grouping, we have these really beautiful, I represent silver objects under the heading of metalwork, and then in the center of it were these things that I found in their storage, slave shackles. And who served the silver? Whose hand could have made these silver objects in apprenticeship situations towards the end of slavery? But certainly, whose labor supported a wealth that could produce the silver? We have all countries have the glories of our countries in one museum, and the horrors in another museum. when they're so interrelated, you'll never have them in the same museum, let alone in the same display case. And at this museum, it was a year earlier that the museums have been around for a long time. It was a year earlier when it was the first time they opened a Civil War room. Before that, they had two. They had the North and they had the South. And it took them, 100 years to get the two in the same space, in the same room. So this was quite a stretch for them, I have to say. And under the heading of modes of transport, just pulling things out of the basement, basically, we have the sedan chair of the last royal governor of Maryland. It's the big boxy thing, and a painting of who had to carry the sedan chair around. And then a ship, which was a model ship that was turned into a slave ship after the War of 1812. And there's actually a full-scale model of this ship like this in Baltimore Harbor called the Pride of Baltimore. Somehow they forgot that other part of that history there. And beneath it are these logs that they had in their storage of livestock and slaves and things like that. And then there were these two baby carriages. And I found this Ku Klux Klan hood in textile storage, anonymously donated. I mean, wouldn't you? And so I laid it in this baby carriage. There was a image on the wall, a photograph of black nannies with white babies with baby carriages, the museum was a little nervous about this. They thought that there might be a problem, but there was no problem. I have a friend who writes about museums quite a bit. Her name is Elaine Gurian, and she said museums are safe places for unsafe ideas, and if you do it right, it's really true. Interestingly, this exhibition was supposed to be up for a couple of months, and it opened for the biggest museum conference in America called the American Association of Museums. So 3,000 museum professionals saw it at their conference, which is why the director, he didn't have a big show to show them. So my project fell in his lap, so he said, well, let's try it. And I'm sure he was, oh God, what did I do? But it opened, and all these people saw it, and it was a very positive experience. And word of this show went all around the country, changed my career. It was just, I had no idea this was going to happen. It was quite amazing. And I have so many anecdotes about what those museum directors said. It's just hysterical. But anyway, I will ask me whenever you see me. After that, after it was up for a while, this big New York Times article came out about it. The museum decided to keep it up for a few more months, and they kept it up for a year after that. And then after the year, because people kept coming to the museum, they're going to take it down, but the staff said we want to have at least some of this permanent in the museum. And so I came back and arranged a smaller version of it on the ground floor, and they asked for this to come back, this image. And I thought for a historical society to deal with this subject, I mean, you should know, let me just tell you that the education department called me while this was up and said, we have a school group coming in, and some of their parents are in the Klan. What should we do? So this is not a dead issue if you thought this was old history in the United States. So for this historical society to do this really meant they want to change, and they were getting it. I just told them don't give out my telephone number, but before the internet. And we had a great conversation. I just felt that they were going to continue this. I would sort of work with them on the show. Nothing ever happened with this. And under the heading of cabinet making, 1800 to 1960, the storage for the furniture and things is called cabinet making, cabinetry. And so I went in the basement and I saw this big wooden thing lying on the ground, and I said, well, what's this? And Carrie said, oh, that's the public whipping post. And it's a grisly object, so I just sort of arranged these chairs in this kind of voyeuristic or crucifixion scene or what have you. But there was this doll's house in the children's area, and I looked in the doll's house, and well, before I even just my going over to, because by then people kind of, by the time I was pulling things out, most of the staff kind of knew what was going on there. Some were very helpful, others were like, you know, not saying much. And so when I went for the doll's house, the woman who tends the doll's house said, "Not the doll's house is nothing sacred." She said that. She absolutely said that. Anyway, I said, "Give me the doll's house." Anyway, but you know, when I looked in the doll's house, they had the white female doll in the kitchen. No, excuse me, she was in the bedroom. The white male doll was in the parlor. The black male doll was standing by the door. The black female doll was in the kitchen, of course. And so I figured, well, let me just mix this up a little bit. Just there like that for the children to take this in uncritically. And I figured, let me just shift this around a little bit. And I don't have real great pictures. I just have this of, I found this other black doll and put it in there facing off with the master house, because you looked in the doll's house and there was overturned furniture and bodies lying around. And this was kind of about, I also found a book about Nat Turner's rebellion. Someone had written their diary about how this freaked them out. And so I made this little diorama of a rebellion. One kid said to me, "Oh, that's Super Slave." I said, "Well, you know, it's sort of anyway." I had one last gallery of this space where these objects I found all around the museum that look really familiar to me, but they were just sort of around there for decoration. They're old, really old things. And I did a little bit of research. Nobody could tell me what they were, where they were from. A little bit of research. They were from West Africa, largely. And I studied art in West Africa as well as here in the United States. And it's interesting how forms don't shift drastically. And they came obviously early with folks who were brought over, and then some things were made in the United States. But they didn't know what they were, and they had been there since late 1800s. And so I made a little display of them. I don't have that image. Very simple, nothing, no mediating anything, just these beautiful little simple objects. Just think about having made these things in the face of all the horror of that period. What I have here, this is the last image of this exhibition. On the table is a book that was written by Benjamin Banneker, who was a free black man of the 1700s who surveyed Washington, D.C. for Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote this book and gave it to Thomas Jefferson. It's a book, not really wrote this book. It's a book of astronomy charts. He was a mathematician and an amateur astronomer, and that's what's above what shows above this is the eclipses of the sun and the moon, which are in the book, which I made into images. And and this is the most important object they had of African American history. So I figured let me end the exhibition with that. And that computer could be probably is in the Historical Society now. It's so old. But anyway, at the time it wasn't that old. It was old, but it's the star date that was in the chart in the book. And the woman is reading some of his entries about diary entries about who tried to kill him, because being free in the 1700s that didn't mean much. And then his crazy dreams. He had wild dreams, and they were written in the book. And he gave this book to Thomas Jefferson to prove that blacks had the same intellect as whites. And so I figured, well, this is an interesting way to end this exhibition. The last image on the wall was this first line of the letter he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, the second president of the United States, in the book. And it said, "Dear sir, I freely and cheerfully acknowledge I'm a member of the African race." And I thought, for a black man in the 1700s in the United States, in a southern state, that was pretty amazing. So that's how I ended the exhibition. And after this exhibition was up for a while, every historical society in America called me, and I'm like, "Thank you, but no thank you. No historical societies for the time being." It was really enough of that experience, because I had never really thought about slavery as a project, as a subject. I'm from New York City. I'm born and raised here. Half my family's are immigrants from the Caribbean, and in New York, everybody's from everywhere. So it's not a subject that I really thought about, much. However, every time I went to Baltimore, I was going back in the past because of this project I was doing. So I really wanted to I was interested in African colonialism at that time. But anyway, this other museum, the Seattle Art Museum, invited me, and I did a project with them. It was a brand new museum, early centuries to contemporary art. And they had, art of other cultures, and this is their great hall. They had, and so they wanted me to do a project, and I said, well, I like to do it anywhere in the museum, and all over the museum. I don't want one gallery. They said, well, all right. And I said, I want to take things from different galleries, from these different spaces, and put them in other locations. They said, well, that's unusual, because it was a new museum, but they organized things just like old museums. You had the ancient gallery of Greece and Rome, and then you went to 19th century, medieval Europe, and then Renaissance Europe, and then 19th century Europe, then 19th century America, then 20th century America, because it was in the 20th century, and connecting the ancient Greeks with Andy Warhol. And then you had the African galleries, the native galleries, the Asian galleries, all on the other floor, nowhere in this March of History or any March of History, just hanging out together on the floor, other floors. And I thought, this is, let's rethink this a little bit. And to sort of to show them, I went to their great hall that was designed by Robert Venturi. And they have these Chinese temple rams, which are facing towards you. Now, apparently, they're supposed to face each other, and that is significant in why these things were made. And so I figured, well, if you can change how they're supposed to be sitting permanently, and it's not correct, certainly my exhibition of moving things around won't bother you. It's a temporary exhibition. So they had to agree with me on that. And this is me talking to the various staff people. Now, how they got a picture of me pointing at people, really, we got along very well. And what these ladies were saying with their pens, I don't know. But it was, really, the great thing about it, because they really enjoyed it, besides the photographers sort of catching me doing this, because normally their meetings were all about raising money and just, the physical building, and they really rarely got to talk about the art that they were in charge of. So they enjoyed these conversations that we had. And so basically I began to do this project. It's a new museum, so they were open. And so I took this area and lit everything as if it was art. I wanted to see the structure of the museum. It's a new museum. It's for the, people went through that emergency exit, but that was just unfortunate. But anyway. And in the first gallery of the ancient world, I put these Maasai and Samburu, African peoples who live at the source of the Nile, around an ancient Egyptian headrest. And even Teddy Roosevelt, one of our presidents, thought that the Maasai and the Samburu had a great, they looked a lot like the ancient Egyptians, if you look at the ancient images. And, so and of course, where did this history begin? But where is Egypt anyway? It's on Africa, on the continent of Africa. So I figured, let's start it there, if you're going to have this march of history at all. And then in the African galleries, I placed this Egyptian sarcophagus lid, because people were talking about the relationship between Egypt and Greece, but in the museums, they were not dealing with that at that time. So I figured, let me just put, not Egypt and Greece, Egypt and the rest of Africa, and the Egyptians and the rest of Africa. So let me just put them all together. This is a sarcophagus lid amongst the African things. And then in the African galleries, I put that man's suit there, you might imagine. And, when I was in Africa, when I was studying in West Africa, you would be in a city, and there were men in suits walking around. But you get to a museum like this, and you sort of forget that they're always about the differences between us, not the similarities. It seems like we have all the various aspects of culture from the world, and that doesn't go the other way around. Well, I'm sorry, it goes the other way around too. And museums are part of that, creating this unreality for various places. And that television doesn't have traditional dancing. It has Nigerian soap operas and fashion shows. And the label ramp, which has photographs of African architecture, not the sort of clay compounds that I had visited, but these are from various cities. There's skyscrapers, mobile stations, cathedrals, things like that. And one person looked at a label, looked at the image, and it was highways. They thought it was Los Angeles. No, it was Lagos, Nigeria. And this turned out to be the first exhibition anywhere in the United States, at least, of African architecture in the international style. This little label thing. And just to really, I mean, there are other things in here, but I have lots of anecdotes. But the curator was in there when these things were being put in, and the suit was already there, and of course the public was still able to walk around. One woman said to her child about the suit. She said, "Oh, well, that's what the Africans wear when they have dinner with the Americans." That she did. I mean, somehow the museum, you try to figure out how the museum, you're trying to think for the museum and make sense for what you expect in a museum rather than what's actually in front of your face. And this is the early 20th century art, and the next slide is what I did to it. Basically moved everything into the corner, spot lit. And, this is one thing. People miss some of the things I did because it was, you had a map and nobody really looked at it. One woman came to the curator and said, it's a very beautiful space and exciting and frenetic, but the Giacometti's in front of the de Kooning and the Matisse is in front of the Arp. Why did you do that? They can barely breathe. Why did you do that? And the curator said, well, I didn't do that. Fred Wilson did that. And he did that because that's how we display the African and Native American things on the other floors. And really, I just want to know what happens when you cluster someone's culture in this manner. And this is how it turns out. This is the gallery of late 20th century art, and this is what I did to it. Basically moved the furniture, put a little barrier around it, and you have the collector's home. There had many different dioramas like that. They had the Chinese scholar's studio. They had the Native American longhouse. But somehow you get to our time, and we don't need a mediating device like that. And I don't live with a Morris Louis painting that big, so I figured, let me see what happens. In fact, on the videotapes, I made videos of the various collectors' homes, looking at all their objects in sort of ethnographic fashion, and to really complete the scene. They were very happy because they got to use it for insurance purposes, so everybody was happy about this. And I do try to, when I can, do things for people as I'm moving things around. This was a museum that had many different cultures, and many of these museums, they were multicultural museums. We're multicultural museums. We have all the cultures in our museums, and I always felt they're about as multicultural as, let's say, Great Britain in 1914. Yes, all the cultures are there, but who decides what's there, what's important about those cultures? And so I decided to do this little project, borrowing things, since they did have all these different cultures, brought them all together in this little display, and then had the museum photographer photograph them, and I had made arrangements of photographs. So here you have Asians as depicted by Africans and Europeans, Africans as depicted by Asians and Europeans. This, of course, is often early contact, or sometimes just imagining what the other looked like. And then, of course, Europeans as depicted by Africans, Asians, and Native Americans. And this piece is called Portrait of Sam because of the Seattle Art Museum, but also because, America is sort of a big clump of different people, and in my neck of the woods, real mixed up as well. And often, as an artist, that if you're trying to depict someone else, you're going to depict yourself as well in there. And to me, that's very referential to these syncretic faces. And it's a good metaphor for museums in general. Now, another painting I didn't do, but this is a painting at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. And again, another project like this is the last project I'm going to show you like this. This is Daniel Webster, a sort of famous statesman and orator of American history. and he apparently saved Dartmouth College from becoming a public institution, which I don't know why that meant it was saved, but anyway, it stayed private. And so the alumni, everyone just loves Daniel Webster, and this is one of their favorite paintings in the collection. But as I went to the storage, they had storage for the art stuff, and then they had deeper storage, and then they had deep, deep storage, which nobody ever went to, as many old museums do. And I found not one or two Daniel Webster images, but 50 images of Daniel Webster, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because some alumni would, lovingly make a painting and give it to and they weren't art students, give a painting to the institution. And so I put them all on view, because it really was a kind of a, it really was a portrait of the institution, all these Daniel Websters. And of course, this was the most favorite part of the exhibition for most of the campus, was all these Daniel Websters. They didn't know that were there. Above this red line, where you'd have one painting of a native person, one painting of I think he was Japanese, and one painting of an African American, one lithograph of a woman, but then you have 50 Daniel Websters. This project was called, well, I'll tell you that in a minute. Oh, I skipped one. But I began to find all these other weird collections that they had. Just so in their deep, deep storage that nobody really knows the people who gave them. And it just made me think about, well, museums collect certain things, individuals collect other things, and sometimes, what's the truth in all this collecting? And, really, why is one better than the other, and what are the reasons for that? And so I just put everything out. There were weird labels, weird objects, why someone tied these arrowheads onto a piece of silk, I don't know. All these weird objects, and then these socks were in the collection, but they're Daniel Webster's socks. They were in the vault on the hill. You had to have special permission to see these socks. I called the exhibition So Much Trouble in the World, Believe It or Not, because, when I do this project, I'm alone, I'm in a hotel room, and I had one CD, which is Bob Marley, and so the title, So Much Trouble in the World, that's where this jumped out. But the other part of it was, believe it or not, there were a couple of reasons why I did that, because George Bush was talking about war at that time, right, the Iraq War, and I was really kind of, upset about this, but the campus was quiet. It was like it wasn't happening. And I was like, is it just me? So I just decided to call it So Much Trouble in the World. Also, believe it or not, because Ripley's, believe it or not, got a honorary doctorate or honorary degree from Dartmouth, believe it or not. And it's because he gave some of his collections to the museum. Now, the museum, there were two museums. There was the Anthropology Museum back then, and Art Museum. And then the Anthropology Museum sort of fell away, and so all that stuff went into deep storage. But I found various, not collections, but, things like these photographs of his exhibitions, and this box top was from his collections and all the different museum names. Now, also, in the deep, deep storage, I found busts. These busts that hadn't been seen for a long, long time. And they were chipped, they were not taken care of. They were in a place that had very little temperature control, if any. And so and obviously they were from the Anthropology Museum, the now defunct Anthropology Museum. And I thought these sculptures were really, interesting. So didn't know what I was going to do with it, except that when I came across this particular one, he looked really familiar to me. And I'm like, why is this man so familiar? Why is this boy so familiar? Excuse me. I realized that I had read a book about him years earlier. His name was Ota Benga. And he came to the United States, was brought to the United States for the World's Fair in 1904 in St. Louis. And at that time, World's Fairs, they bring people from all around the world and set them all up so that people could see them. And they'd set them in sort of habitats and things so people could see what they look like and what. I don't even. It's kind of something hard for people today to understand what that was about. Having people from other parts of the world looked at. So he actually came to the United States with a man. It wasn't like he was. I used to think that there was a problem why he was brought, but apparently, being a pygmy in the Congo, the Belgian Congo, was not fun. And pygmies generally are not considered, even by the other Africans, are not particularly wholly human. They're little, they live in the forest, they don't like living in cities. So they were discriminated against, and there was quite a bit of genocide against them. And his wife and his daughter were killed in these inter-ethnic battles. And so he was, yes, I'll go. And he talked other people to come to the United States for this as well. Of course, he left for sad reasons. Anyway, so he was at the World's Fair, and then after the World's Fair was over, he decided to stay. He stayed. He was brought to the United States, and someone thought it was a great idea to put him in the chimpanzee cage in the Bronx Zoo, and this is the 20th century. So this was people were outraged and freaked out by this. Certainly, African American clergy had him brought out of the Bronx Zoo, and so he ended up living in the Museum of Natural History for quite a while, where he showed people his crafts, the different cultural things that he did. Now there were no other, as far as I know, there were no other pygmies, so no one spoke his language. So he learned some rudimentary English, I imagine, but it must have been a very lonely existence. And I guess he stayed in the United States for about 10 years because he moved to Virginia, where he shot himself at age 31 or 32. So obviously this was a memory I had of him, and I decided to, because I knew this one person, I didn't know all these other people, but it made me sort of think about their lives and the complexity of their lives, which no one will ever know. I put these white sashes on there because one is an honorific gesture, but also in certain cultures, white is a symbol of mourning, symbol of, funereal symbol. And so depending on, your perspective, I thought it was a nice, important gesture. But also on these, where I'm covering over is actually the tribal names. Not their name, but just the tribe that they're from. This, I guess she was from the Philippines because the United States had, was involved with the Philippines, let's put it that way, for a while. And so, which had the tribal names. And so I covered it up so you had to take them in as people and not just referencing the tribe that the Natural History Museum would want you to reference. In addition, beneath each one, wrote something. This one says, "Someone knows my mother." But each one has something that I thought of, and perhaps they were thinking, or just what I thought they might be thinking. And to a one, they all were, look, sad, mad, serious. I mean, nobody was really smiling. But that's because these were not carved sculptures. These were not, made in clay. These were life casts. So these folks in the Museum of Natural History commissioned all these life casts to be made by the man whose initials, CM, are on their chests, while they were at the World's Fair. And they sold them to all these natural history museums around the country. And so, obviously they said, just hold your breath, and they put all this, stuff on their faces. And I dare say many of them didn't speak English. He's a Native American man here. And, I got really interested in this subject. I went into the Museum of Natural History and found the original casts of these people. And the original casts, they were like really grimacing, really making funny faces because, this was being, and then the artist came and sort of kept them from really looking bad, sort of covering up that history. And so the curators asked me if I wanted one of the things restored. I said, no, I want even most recent history about these objects to be there. The chipping, it shows how the museum really felt about these objects. And also in this deep storage were these hands. And I just found it fascinating. All the hands had names, but the busts did not. These are great men. the third room of this, really everything was getting darker, and this definitely had to do with this impending war. I had, from their collections, I had these French engravings by James Callot, a 17th century engraver, called The Miseries of War. I don't have close-up pictures of them. It's about the horrors of the 30-year war, and so it has soldiers burning and pillaging towns and being executed and hung. And so this was about more and more about the war that I was thinking about and seeing it in their collection. This seemed to be a very ghostly hat. Daniel Webster's hat, by the way. And beneath it says, "Let us not be pygmies in a case that calls for men." This is one of the lines. He was very famous for being against war, and he's brought out every time there's a war. People quote him. Of course, he was against the Civil War, which I have some problems with. But anyway, so his words were all around the museum gallery, and all these artworks were shrouded. Many of the artworks were shrouded with these black fabric. And it's because, in our museums, art museums, you have things on view that may be problematic, may be about death and destruction and such. And I figured, well, let me slow down, and some really horrific images, so let me just slow down your reception of them by shrouding them. You can lift them up and look at it or not. And the viewer can have be an active participant in how you receive images. This is from Goya's Disasters of War, and which they had, and which things like this I shot it so you'd have to lift the veil and see. And of course, Goya did this to raise money for the rebels to fight against the French, the invading French. And so that's basically how this looked. There was in storage, museum storage, there's always, when you see a bust, it's always standing up erect, and they put it together, or they just leave the bust standing erect. But in storage, things are laying on their side. And whenever I looked in there, especially in my mindset about war, they looked like the broken body and certainly these things could have been broken during wars, or by natural disasters, or someone sort of hacking these to be sold in the market. But so I just want to evoke that war by just putting them on their side. And I made after the show was over, I asked them if I could 3D image and make a copy of Ota Benga, so I could, keep him around, not let this just die with this temporary exhibition, because those things went back into storage, disappeared, and so he still exists. As a bronze, and it says underneath it, you can't really see it here, but it's on the wood. It says, "I'm the one who left and didn't come back," basically talking to the pygmies back home. That's my imagining. I don't know where we are with time. I'm just barreling along. It's so warm in here. This is the Venice Biennale. I represent the U.S. in Venice in 2003. Great experience. Well, it had its ups and downs, but it's a great experience. And I thought perhaps I'd do something about this building, which is very Jeffersonian. But there's all of Venice. Turn around and there's Venice, this incredible city. And so I wanted to do it about Venice. And in fact, I had lots of thoughts about Venice. I had been to Venice quite a bit, and I had lots of thoughts about it. Interestingly, in the paintings and door knockers and all these historic paintings, you have these images of Africans in the paintings. Of course, this is the Magi, and of course, Mantegna did not do the painting of the Magi from people weren't sitting there, but in the periphery there were Africans in Venice, lots of them, and in fact they represented Venice in a certain way. For the Venetians, they still do, because they came to Venice after 1492, when everybody was expelled from Spain. So the Moors are in all these images. And in this huge image by Veronese, there are about 10 people. And, I have an African-American friend who said, "Oh, you ruined Venice for me. All I see is black people now." But anyway, I couldn't help it. And so in all these paintings, there's many different characters. Most of them are waiter boys, and how these boys got there. There was no actual slavery in Italy. but they were there. And fascinating in these old paintings, this is by Carpaccio, this is not about the character in the front, but it's a city scene. These Venetian painters painted the city and what was going on there. And so this character was a gondoliere, and I found out that there was there was a whole club of black gondolieres, gondolier drivers in Venice at that time. And this guy, as you can see, this guy in the far right, jumping off into the canal to grab the cross, but somebody got it first. And then this painting by Tiepolo of this boy in the corner, and this boy in the corner is the same boy that I saw in my mother's book, and he's getting older. Tiepolo painted him several times, so he started young and he got older. And here's another one of him in one of Tiepolo's paintings, as obviously an older young man. And then here he is at the original painting. And it was great to find out, I had the moment to do all the research, that his name was Ali, and he worked in Tiepolo's studio. So he really did exist. So the project was called Speak of Me as I Am, which is a title from Othello's, from Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, the most famous Moor of Venice. And so the whole piece was about the Africans of Venice from the 1500s to the present. I made copies of these, I made figures of all the characters that I saw in these paintings, reproducing the materials that they were wearing in silks and satins, and had them displayed through this image on the wall. In front of this wall, which seemed to be like a wall, like one of these fancy stores in San Marco Square, were these handbags, which I had made from the same fabric that I made the costumes from. And the Senegalese folks are selling them in all the streets of Venice and also all over Europe. And so I thought this was a way to sort of connect the historic Africans of Venice to the contemporary. And I got to know a bunch of them. And people, you can see the image of the people lining up to get into the pavilion. They were not exactly thrilled when they went over to see if they could buy one of these things, and the guy said they're not for sale. But the point was that they would, if they did engage with him, he would speak to them, and he spoke several different languages, about the plight of the Senegalese in Italy, which is, they have a lot of problems. And as you went into the building, I got there when the war was starting up with Bush's war in Iraq, and so the Italians were all up in arms about this. There was big rallies and everything, and so we had this conversation, and I said, well, listen, if you don't say that I'm like George Bush, I won't say you like Berlusconi. And so after that, everything was fine. But I placed these images, they're actually images, not sculptures, in front of the building because I thought Americans would think they were American slave images. But in fact, if you're Venetian, you know that these are huge sculptures in this church, the Frari Church in Venice, of these they were spoils of the wars with the Turks. And so they're these huge sculptures, both interesting that they're both the Venetian and the American empires, and looking at them through the lens of Africans. As you stepped in, there was this huge chandelier, huge, and it was this big black chandelier. I painted the ceiling to reference the basilica in Venice, in San Marco Square, but I had been working with glass right before this, and so it had glass in my mind. Of course, Murano is where all the glass is made in Venice, and they have all these chandeliers. This is a particular style chandelier, usually in white and pastel colors. And so I went to the glass blowers and I said, I wanted this Rosanico style chandelier, and I want it very big. They said, no problem. I said, I want it really big. No problem. I said, I want it in black glass. Black glass! Artists, But anyway, he said, well, I work with Yoko Ono, so I can do this anyway. This is the first black glass chandelier anywhere in the world. Of course, soon after, you can see these black chandeliers with little gold on it in all over Venice. And Philip Stark, a few months later, in his show in Paris, had a black chandelier. Then Urban Outfitters and blah, 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 blah. Well, it's fine. I mean, I got mine. Let's put it that way. The piece is called "Speak of Me as I Am." It really, to me, it represented Othello. It was big. It was monstrous. It was magnificent. It was mournful, and so it really embodied this character, Shakespeare's character. In front of all these hotels there, they have these black figures with their heads, and I just said, obviously they're copies of historic ones, which were from the paintings. So I decided to get a bunch of them, and this one is called The Wanderer. And this is sort of a montage of photographs of the Africans that I met, as well as the historic Africans in the paintings. And here's the head of one of those figures that his face, I just couldn't cut off his head. But at any rate, but I do, when I work with objects, I didn't show too many of the objects that done in the past, but when I work with objects, I just flip them around, try to figure out how, what juice is in them. There's something in there. And this one, I took off his pillow that they have on their, I don't know what that's about. They have a pillow always on their hands. I took off the pillow, and there were the pegs sitting in his wrists. And it was like he was showing me his pegs. It was just so amazing. This is called it's called Faith's Fate. And again, all these works were made in Venice. These are plaster casts I saw in Venice, and the black figures probably were to hold up tabletops, and they have a very strange relationship with Africanness in Venice. It's part fantasy, part historic, but it's taken to this kind of wild degree there. I mean, I think Africans in Venice are kind of like the Moors of Venice are kind of like Native Americans for many people in the United States, like Pocahontas. They're nowhere else, so they kind of represent the United States. A lot of people think they've never met an Indian, which is probably not true, but it's kind of this fantasy representation of the country, and that's what Moors are in Venice. Oh, that piece is called Helping Hands. Those are actual carved hands by Canova on there. This is called Love's Blindness. I like making works wherever I am. This is called Spark. These are big acetylene torches here, and I just hooked up to this figure, and I just felt, I sometimes personify the black characters, and I feel like, well, if he wanted to light it up, he could really light it up. And this one, if he didn't want to be lit, these are, extintores, they're fire extinguishers. This is called Shatter. These are things you can buy in Venice, these kitsch items. They're larger than they normally have them, and they certainly don't have what's in the center, which is a Molotov cocktail. And, this was also in the exhibition, which was the first piece of glass that I ever made. I was just taking a class at Pilchuck Glass School in Seattle, and this is the form that came out, these drip forms. And I worked with a spectacular glass artist named Dante Marioni, who's very famous, and he and I got along well, and he enjoyed making these objects for me, and so we still continue working together. I work in Venice and Seattle. And it's just called Drip, Drop, Plop. I didn't really want to, because I'm always responding to a given situation. This was an opportunity not just to make something out of my head, which was something new for me. It sounds odd as an artist, but, and so this is what came out. And in actual, you can see some of them have eyes, and that really kind of freaked me out. I mean, it probably bothers nobody in this room because you're not my age. But I realized that these images, these eyes, came from, they look cute, but it comes from my childhood of these racist cartoons that would be on television. And this sort of image just bubbled up. And so I put them on some of them just to reference that, but really, the sort of disintegration of the black body to inanimate materials like ink, tar, oil, and but I kind of got over that after a while and just was interested in the history of oil and other materials. I did this drawing on it's one of the first things, a little drawing I did on this globe. And also a lot of this came because when I was in school, Robert Smithson, among others, was very influential to me. This is one of his drawings. And so also the notion of entropy in these kind of elemental materials of tar, again, Robert Smithson, and asphalt and things like that, also interested me. These are all Robert Smithson. And so obviously I found these much later after I had been making these things and realized, oh, that's where the hell this came from. But this is called the Ominous Glut. This is called Dark Dawn. And that's plate glass. It's called float glass on the floor. It's you can't find it anymore. It's no longer in existence. Viscous Risk. And it's kind of, now for me it's almost like like drawing with glass, and it's just, of all the things I do, it's kind of something that I just do to. It's just a very fluid and flexible thing for me to do. And then after that first big chandelier, I realized when it came to the United States, because in Venice it was over your head, and when I came to the United States it was really low, and it was so huge, it looked like a body, and that really struck me. And so at that point, it wasn't only a metaphor for Othello, it really was a body in front of me. And so that really got me thinking, and this piece came out of thinking about the body. It's basically, I wanted the blackness gravity to pull it out of the body. It looked like it's doing that. It's not doing it at all. In fact, there is no color black in glass. It's a very dense red. And so the grays are not any like a less of a black. They're actual gray, chemically gray pigments that I tried to make look like it was sort of gravity was pulling it out of the piece. And after I made it, I realized during that period my father was sick, and he did die. And I realized this was kind of thinking about mortality. It's actually called To Die Upon a Kiss, which is a line from Othello. And his mortality and what really is life and what is left behind, and where does it go, and all these kind of questions that come up when someone really close to you passes. And so I thought it was a kind of heavy thing of this leaking and falling, but then when it was made and I saw it, because these things, I dream them up, and then I see them when everybody else sees them when they're done, and it looked like something was rising up, which was a very exciting experience for me to see something else was happening with this piece. And I also enjoy working with the artisans, as I said, in Venice, because they enjoy working with me on their things. And this was several, it was just recently at Pace a year ago, several mirrors that they make, but only in black glass, and they're stacked up on each other. It's called Iago's mirror, as if Iago is dreaming up, in his jealous rage, dreaming up Othello through his. And here it is, a close-up of it. And the last image I'll show you is, I do things with mapping. This is a map of the Atlantic slave trade, a map of the Indian Ocean slave trade, and the producers and consumers of oil. The piece is called The Unnatural Movement of Blackness. And basically, it's the corrupt economy of the 19th century and the corrupt economy of the 20th century, all in the color black. And that's it. Thanks for being so. The wall colors in my Museum, basically they're historic colors. I wanted that to be clear. They're not as directly related to any particular history. I was cognizant of the blue and the gray of the South and the North and the South, whatever. But it wasn't really meant to kind of signify that. in a strong way at all. Um, yeah, and at this point, I don't even remember beyond that what I was thinking about that. But I am interested in using historic colors because it's a reference that people know. But then how I use it, I think about how those colors affect you anyway. If it's red as opposed to green or gray, uh, and that goes into my thinking about what's going to be in front of it. It's a combination of that. Yeah. Sometimes I have the aha moment, like the Silver in the Shackles, that came to me. Some of my best works are from these aha moments, and then I just have to see it in front of me. And then other things, I just have a feeling about with my works, a kind of a feeling about, and so I make them to understand. And certainly with the museum projects, I do things. It's sort of an investigation. I want to see it in front of me, these thoughts that I have, and see if they bear fruit. Um, so, it's a comedy. It happens in multiple ways. It just has to be really real for me, not, kind of like I like it or kind of like, no kind of like is in my vocabulary. And so some people produce a huge number of things, but I generally don't. I'm very, with this piece, I mean, obviously there's a relationship with the drawing on the globe, but this came so much long after that. It just struck me. I've been working with certain materials. Other things start to come from just being with the material. Really real for me? Is that that's not very descriptive, is it?
What does it mean? Yeah, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I know. What does that mean? Really real? Really real for me? I don't know. I feel it in my body. I have a kind of a physical response to some of these things, positive and negative. And sometimes the negative ones make me really think it must be really important to me. If I'm having like those drips, why would that? No, wouldn't bother anybody but me. And so I just do them just to see what that is. There's lots of things I didn't show which related to black collectibles that was really the whole reason for making the pieces was just to sort of exercise whatever that was bothering me about them. But so generally, one thing's conceptual artists just have an idea and they just put it down, and that's it. And for me, it's much more complex than that, and that's kind of what I meant by real. And then when you step back and look at your work, you kind of get a sense of the arc of it when you see it all together. And so, that's kind of how it works for me. And I lately what I'm really interested in color, and not only the phenomenological experience of color, but also the varied meanings of color, particularly black these days. What they mean beyond for different people, and how they can mean several things at once, and so that's been really intriguing me. And I try to push them one way or another, and try to sort of make them all evident at the same time. Well, yeah, it's been really. I mean, I don't like to, but. People come up to me and talk to me about this. Because so many museum people saw it, it had a huge impact on various levels of various kinds of museum professionals. And, I should say about that particular thing I always like to say is that you had to go through the whole museum and see that project. And then you had this experience like, oh my God, this guy, this is his view of this thing. But then you went back through the museum and you realized the museum was just as subjective as I was, but you didn't notice it when you went through the museum. They had their point of view really strong, but you didn't notice it. And for me, the project was not as so much about, it's about slavery. That was basically the narrative, but really it was about the museum and how they have so much control over how you think about things. And just to reveal that by doing something so subjective that you realize that they were being subjective as well. And the thing is, museums change very slowly, but individuals can change faster. And no one is at the Historical Society now that was there then. They're all at other museums. And the same with all my projects, except for Seattle. Most of the people are still in the museum. But generally, people move to other museums. They take experience of all art. Art is something that's very personal to you. You sit in front of an artwork, you have your own personal experience with it, and you take something with it. And so the museum professionals take this with them wherever they go. And so you see these things happening, and it definitely has its resonances in what I did. So, which I had no idea. I mean, I had no idea about all that. But it is kind of amazing that it did. They said some of the directors said, "I've never had an emotional experience in a museum before," and I'm like, "Well, that's very sad," but it really made a difference. And I should say also that for the time that exhibition was up, everyone in the museum, they didn't say it, but everyone in the museum knew that the understaff understood the museum much more than the professional staff. And it was a kind of interesting time, for that moment, because the guards, the maintenance people, they really had a deep relationship with the subject, whereas the curators did not. It's like one of those terms that get put on you, and so it's not a bad term, and because it is a critique, certainly a lot of those pieces, and I can whenever I think my work is shifting and more. I didn't want to go on and on, but the Manus piece I did in Savannah, similar subject, but much more metaphorical and physical, and not. It's just different. It's not about museum critique. But it does, has an impact, but it's not particularly about the museum. It's interesting with those projects, museum projects, the museum people understood it in some ways better than the average people. And, somebody who was just a registrar got it because there's all this language of the museum embedded in it. But institutional critique, I mean, we all know each other, all these the folks of the same general period doing this. We all do these things in our own way, and I don't know if we'd all agree that we're all doing the same, under this heading, but it's, I don't disavow it at all. I think it's, perfectly great. I just don't like I don't think any artist likes to be pinned down as, this is what you do, this is what you are. Yeah, I have no problem with it.
But it does seem like we are on the other side of a period of dramatic change.
And there's a variety of reasons for that I see. When I first started, there were no women museum directors at all, anywhere.
There's still not a single director of color in this city.
No.
Studio Museum.
Right, and she was. That's a whole long story about her being booted out of the Whitney, but years ago. But it really my experience with museums, that there's been a shift with having women museum directors, because they come into this environment where there was a glass ceiling, and they understand about otherness and difference, and so it's a different conversation. There's a lot of things you don't have to say, as opposed to those from before, who it was kind of all new to them, and the racial thing, the cultural thing of non-professional staff still pervades, and I'm sure that'll shift in time, but it's still an issue. But museums I think, have really moved forward in temporary exhibitions. You'll see things here and there and how they do things, but permanently, which I haven't done a permanent project besides there's one up at New York Historical Society as you first walk in. It's a project that's permanent. But otherwise, I haven't done it either. But what are these museums going to do that makes them critique themselves just in a permanent way, which is what the Historical Society up in New York City, is trying to do with my piece, that sort of guides you to see the rest of the museum in different ways than you would normally. But generally, that's the next thing, is to, what do you have up for a long time that would allow for multiple ways of thinking about it, critiquing yourself, or letting the viewer understand that this is not a master narrative. But it's a slow change, because the public doesn't necessarily know that museums are not the only purveyors of truth. The public wants truth from the museum. They expect it, and so when the museums try to try to give a different point of view, it really confuses them, angers them sometimes, because they have this whole long history of being the authoritative voice, and not one voice out of many, or one way to do things out of many. So the public has to be brought along slowly as well.
Yeah, where the museums can be multivocal themselves.
Yes, exactly. And they try in different ways. Certain museums try, but
I can tell the natives are getting restless.
Yeah.
But it just one last thought, which is that it seems like your work has multiple, in that phase, really had multiple audiences. And
Yes.
it was a kind of a social practice where the museum itself was part of the audience. They were
Yes.
collaborating with you, but you were really changing that.
yes, I'm cognizant of all these different levels of types of engagement and different ways of reading the exhibition. That's the fun. That's also really fun for me. But it doesn't work unless I talk to everybody. It's what I do. I talk to everybody, get them to know me. I get to know them, and they influence me as much, without them knowing it, as much as I'm, more than I think I'm influencing them. But yeah. No, no. I mean, no, not by other people's practices so much, because I had, I had a fire in the belly because the museums were a problem, and they upset me how blind they were to their own denial, and it was all about my life, my culture, and others, and it just was so blatant, and they seemed to not know what there was. I mean, it was kind of outrageous. Anybody now could go back in time and see some of the exhibitions. It would jump out at you too. We're just now much more aware, but it really was a fire in my belly to sort of do something else. I mean, I like that I'm connected to art history, Breuters and Duchamp and all that. But really, it's piggybacking on all these great people, but it really was because I was just fed up with these institutions not being self-reflexive and not seeing themselves, and then deciding things for others from their very narrow vantage point. So that's where it started. Well, I think, thank you.